and Instagram went live. But then, especially after mid 2000s, there's just explosion of websites. This is websites where applications, services that we use every day now. So this is a 2019 data. So we're looking at like 1.71 billion sites, applications, services online. This is 2019, and you can imagine what it must be like in 2020 with everybody, doing online work, digital transformation. Actually, I recently heard Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella talking about this. He said in just the first 2 months of this lockdown, the pandemic, 2 years worth of digital transformation occurred. So you can imagine what this number is going to look like in 2020. There's, with everybody just, working online, and Instagram went live. But then, especially after
why I brought this up is this translates to tons of data being created every single day.
This is websites where applications, services that we use every day.
From our activities every day,
this is a
we generate
2019 data.
What you see on the right
so
is
we're looking at like 1.7
snapshot of like
1
to show
billion
you
that'll work.
sites, applications, services online.
John, can you mute
This
John?
is 2019, and you can imagine what it must be like in 2020.
Yeah, so what you see here on the on the right
doing,
is what a data looks like.
Work
gives you perspective to the amount of data that's
transformation.
generated,
Actually, I
created
recently
every
heard
day.
Microsoft
That's like
CEO
500 million
talking
tweets
about
going
this.
out,
He said in just the first 2 months
294
of this,
billion
lockdown,
websites, emails being sent,
this
4 petabyte of data.
The pandemic. 2 years worth
created
of digital transformation
on Facebook. This
so
is like about
you can imagine what this number is going to look like in 2020.
300,
there's with everybody
350 million
working online, working from home.
Yeah, so 350 million.
Why I brought this up is this
100 million
to
hours
tons of data
of
being created every
by
single
2025
day.
It's expected 463.
So
I think this is like
from
this is
our activities every day, we
12
generate data. What you see
bytes
on
of
the
data
right
created
is
every day.
a snapshot.
So this is
of,
data that's
show
created
you,
every day, every
that'll
single
work.
day and stored
anything in there?
in a distributed system across the globe behind very different services, right? So
yeah, so what you see here on the right is what the data looks
how
like.
can we store it? How can we securely access
the
it?
amount of data that's being generated,
and
created every
how
single day.
can we
That's like 500 million
share it easily
tweets
and
going
securely
out,
share
every day. 294 billion.
There were some early
emails
attempts
being sent. 4 petabyte of data.
To achieve this, and what you see on the right
created
here is
on Facebook.
account.
This is like about
Facebook
350.
They had these tools where they would ask you,
350 million,
what email do you use? Yahoo.
Yeah, so 350
AOL,
million photos
MSN, or
posted,
or
100
Gmail.
million hours
Okay.
of
tell us what
watched.
username,
By
what
2025
your
it's
email,
expected
and then what's the password you use.
I think
And then
this
we're
is
gonna
like, this is
go log
10
in
the
and
power
pull
of
your
12
contact list and find who is on
bytes
Yelp
of
or
data
who's on
created
Facebook and
created
suggest
so
for
this
you
is
guys to connect,
data
right?
that's created
So this is
every day, every
an
single
early
day
attempt
from
by
and
these companies. Probably there are more. I found
in
this,
a distributed
mentioned
system
online.
across the globe behind
Early
very
attempt to
different
try
services,
to
right?
so connect this
question
data
is,
that's
how can
behind
we
different
securely
services
store this? How can we
and,
store it?
make
How
use of
can
it?
we securely access it?
But what's the problem with that? This
And
is
how
they
can
are
we,
actually Facebook Yelp, they are
share it
asking
easily
you.
and
They give you
securely
a form to give them your password and username so that they can log
there were
in
some
just like
early attempts
you would on your behalf and pull information
to achieve
data.
this. And what you see on the right here is Yelp.com.
But what's the problem with
Facebook.com.
that? So the problem with that is it's actually called
they
password
had
anti-pattern. It's an anti-pattern.
Where
so
they would ask you,
giving
what email
your
do you
credentials
use?
to your email,
Yahoo,
for a third
AOL,
party app.
It has three fundamental problems or issues.
All right. Okay.
First
Tell
of
us what
all,
username is, what your email,
for
and
a
then what's your
better user
password you use.
experience or
And then we're gonna
usability, the
go
app,
log in and
Yelp or
pull your
Facebook or
contact
whatever app,
list and find who is on
is
Yelp or
probably
who is on
going to
Facebook,
want
and
to store your
suggest
credentials
for you
rather than
guys to connect, right? So
asking
this is
you
an early attempt
to
by these
provide
companies
those
that probably there
credentials
are more. I
every
found
single
this
time they
actually
use.
mentioned online.
They try to pull your contact list
Early
could be or
attempt to
whatever they
try
want from
to
your data.
connect this data that's
They
behind
want
different
they may want
services
to store it. So what
and
does that mean
make use
is
of it.
what that means is you now have
But
a
what's the
third party
problem with
app
that? This
storing your
is they
credentials
are actually
somewhere that you
Facebook,
don't
Yelp.
have
They are
control over,
asking
right? So
you.
it opens
They
you up
give you a
for attack.
form to give them your
And
password
if
and
you are like
username
many
so
people,
that they can log
you
in just
probably
like
use the
you would
same
your behalf and
credentials, the same
pull
password, or
information
even
data
email. I mean, the same email, even
they
password
like.
for different
But what's the problem with that?
services.
So the
So which
problem with
means
that
like
is it's actually called
it
password
just
anti-pattern. It's an
maximizes your
anti-pattern. So basically, you're
potential of
giving
being
your credentials to your email,
vulnerability.
for a third-party
That's
app.
one problem.
It
The
has
other
three
problem is
fundamental problems
this
or
app
issues. First of
only
all,
wanted to be able to pull the
for a
piece of
better
your
user
piece of
experience or user
information,
usability, the
like for
app,
Yelp or
Yelp or Facebook or whatever app,
Facebook, they probably
is
just wanted
probably
to
going to
see
want to store your
if
credentials
any
rather
of your
than
contacts
having
are
asking
on
you
their platforms, so that they can
to
suggest
provide
for you
those
to
credentials
to
every
join
single
or to
time they
connect.
use. They try to
So
pull
for that, they
your
would
contact
only
list. It could
want,
be or whatever
they
they
would
want
only
from
need
your
maybe
data.
the name or the email address of your
They may
contacts.
want to store it. But what does that mean
But
what that
there
means
is no
is you
way
now
to
have a
limit that,
third-party app
to
storing
say,
your
all right,
credentials
here you go,
somewhere
go
that you
only
don't
get
have control
this,
over,
because you just
right? So
give
it
them the
opens you up
master
for
key to
attack.
your system, right?
And if you
Like
are
if
like
we
many
take, for
people,
example, Gmail,
you probably
your
use the
Gmail
same
is the low, like the master
credentials,
key
the
to
same password,
anything
or even email. I mean, the
Google
same email,
provides, right?
even
Not just your
password
emails, your
for different
drives, your
services. So
YouTube
which
TV
means
account,
like
your TV channel, I mean
it
YouTube
just
channel. Everything is
maximizes
just behind your account. So
potential
you give
being
them the master key. There's no way to say,
vulnerability.
to limit
That's one
the
problem. The
permission
other problem
for that
is
third party app. That's the
this
second problem.
app
The third problem is
only wanted to be able to
when
pull
you
piece
want
of
to
your
revoke
piece of
access. Like,
information,
okay, so now
like for
you
Yelp
have,
or
a different social media that
Facebook.
you
They
want to use.
probably just
Not,
wanted to
you want
see
to just drop
if
uninstall
any
Facebook
of
or
your
whatever,
contacts are
or you have another,
on their platforms, so that they can
suggestion or
suggest
review engine
for you to
other than Yelp that you
to
want to
join
use.
or to connect.
So you want to
So
revoke
for that, they
the
would
access
only
you
want,
provided.
they would only need maybe
How do you do
the
that?
name
The
or the
only way
email address
you could do
of
that
your
is by changing
contacts.
your credentials.
But
But
there is
by
no
changing your
way to
credentials,
limit
what you
that
just did
to
is not
say,
only
all
you
right, here
blocked
you
or
go, go
revoked
only
access to
get
these
this,
apps that you wanted
because you just give
to
them the
revoke, you
master key
also
to your
did the same thing
system,
for
right? Like
other
if we take,
third-party
for
apps you may
example,
have set up before, right?
Your
Because
Gmail is
you just you give your
the
master key to
master
different
key to anything
apps. Now
Google
you change your
provides, right?
master
Not
key,
just your emails,
everybody is
your
gonna fail
drives,
to
your
get to your data.
YouTube
So
TV
that's the
account,
other
your
problem.
TV
There's
channel, I
no
mean YouTube channel.
way,
Everything
easy
is
way
just
to
behind your account.
revoke
So
access
you give them the master
for
key.
this
There's no
particular
way
app.
to say, to
Now, what's the
limit
solution then?
the permission
Then this is the
for that
solution.
third party
Actually,
app.
Auth
That's
is
the
the
second
solution.
problem. The third problem
Auth
is
is this is exactly how or
when you
why
want
Auth
to
is
revoke
designed.
access. Like, okay,
So
so now
what's
you
Auth?
have,
So we're going
a
to talk about
different
Auth
social
2.0.
media that you want to use.
Auth
Not,
generally
you want to
is
just
HTTP
drop
based access
and install
delegation
Facebook or
framework.
whatever, or
So
you have
the
another,
keywords there
suggestion
is
or a review
HTTP based. Of
engine
course, it's
other than
only
Yelp that
designed
you
for
want to
HTTP
use.
protocol, not
So you
not
want
other
to revoke
other protocols.
the access you
The other
provided
is
to them. Or
it's an access
how
delegation
do you do
framework.
that? The only way
It's where
you could
you
do that is by
delegate
changing your
access for
credentials.
a third party app to your own
But
data.
by changing your credentials, what you
So
just did
Auth
is not
2.0
only you
is
blocked
a
or revoked
successor
access to
for
these
Auth
apps that
1.0. Even if
you
they're,
wanted to revoke, you
it's
also
a
did the
successor,
same thing for
there's no backward
other third-party
compatibility.
apps you may have
Actually,
set up
Auth
before,
1.0
right? Because
is considered
you give
it's
your master
obsolete,
key to different
should not be used.
apps.
It's
Now
not
you
used
change your
anymore.
master key. Everybody's gonna fail
Yeah,
to get
Auth 2.0 is much
to your data. So that's the
refined,
other
much more
problem.
refined
There's
and
no
simplified and granular.
easy way to revoke access
It enables
for this particular
you
app.
to give a time and
Now, what's the
resource
solution
limited
then?
access
Then this is the
to
solution.
your
Actually,
data
Auth
for
is
a
the
third
solution.
party
Auth
application.
is this is
Right?
exactly
So let's see
why
how
Auth is
Auth
designed.
2.0
So what is
resolves the
Auth?
issues
So
we
we're
saw
going to talk
earlier
about Auth
by
2.0.
the
Auth
issues
generally
associated
is
with
HTTP
the
based access
sharing your password. for third-party apps. But before we see that,
keywords there is
before we see
HTTP
how
based.
it
Of
solves
course,
the
it's
issue,
only
let's
designed
define
for HTTP protocol.
terminology.
Nothing, no other protocol.
So actors
the other is
are
it's an access delegation
that
framework.
interact
it's where you
in the
delegate
on
access for a third-party app to your
so
own
there are
data.
four actors: the client,
so Auth
resource
2.0
owner, resource
is
provider,
a successor
and
for
Auth
Auth
provider.
1.0. Even if
The client is the third-party
it's a
app
successor, there is no backward
the app that
compatibility.
wants, or the
Actually,
service
Auth
that wants to be able
1.0
to access
is
your data
considered
from
dead,
another
like
service.
it's obsolete.
There
should not
could
be
be
used.
there are two types
it's
of
not used
clients: a public client and a confidential
Auth
client.
2.0 is
Public client
refined, much more
is
refined and simplified and
when
granular.
you have
it
a client
enables
where you could
to give a
store
time and resource
I mean,
limited
there's
access
no way to securely
to your data
store
for a third-party
client secret,
application,
right? So,
so
any
let's see
secret
how
associated with the
Auth
Auth flow
resolves the issues we
for
saw
example,
earlier
the single-page
by
application that
the
runs on a
the
user's
issues
browser,
associated with
you cannot possibly store
sharing your
anything
password
securely
for
on
third-party
there.
apps. But before we
Or
see
if
that,
it's like
we see how
a native
we see
app,
how it solves the issue.
where
Let's define
it's also impossible
terminology.
to
Actors.
store securely.
So
So
actors
they are called public
are
clients.
entities
There
that
are also
interact
confidential clients that have a way to
on
store
Auth flow.
Auth
So
related
there are four
secrets
actors: a client,
securely.
resource owner.
So we're gonna come back to this
Auth
two
provider.
kinds of
A
clients
client is the
later
third-party
on,
app
but
that
that's
we're talking about.
that's what
The app that wants, or the
resource
service
owner
that wants to
basically
be
the
able to
user,
access your data from
who owns
another
the
service.
data. Resource
There
provider
could
is the
be
service
there
that
are two
provides a
types of
secure API
clients:
to
a public
access your
client
data.
and a
The
confidential
Auth
client.
provider is actually the
Public
system
client
that has
is
implemented the Auth
when
protocol or Auth
you
framework,
have
and provides
it's a client
identity
where
and
you could
authentication for the systems to
store.
interact with
I mean,
each other.
there's no way to
Now,
securely
once we define
store
our actors, let's see
client
how
secrets,
a
right?
typical
So
Auth flow looks like and how
any
it
secret
solves the
related
issues
associated with the
we
Auth
saw,
flow.
the issues we saw earlier.
Look, for example,
So a
the single-page
typical
application that
Auth
runs on
flow
a
looks
user's
like
browser,
the first,
you cannot possibly
the
store
app
anything securely on there.
requests
Or if it's like a
access
native
to
app
a resource,
where
right? Makes
it's also
an API
impossible
call to say,
to
hey, give me a
store
contact
securely.
list or an image
So they are
from
called
this
public
input,
clients.
and this says, oh, you're
there are
not
also
logged in.
confidential clients
You're not authorized.
that have a way
Here's what
to store
please log in here. So it
Auth
sends a
related
302
secrets
redirect to the client.
securely.
This is
So we're
just
gonna come
typical,
back
but
to
it
this
might not be
two
it might not
kinds
be a
of
302. Like this is a
later on,
single page
but
application.
that's client.
This might
That's
just
what
send
client
you
is.
straight, clicking
Resource
on a
owner,
sign in
basically
button
the
or
user,
clicking
you
on
who owns the
pull
data.
contacts or
Resource
whatever.
provider is the
it might
service
just
that
send you
provides a
straight to,
secure API
this, but
to access your data.
so
the
you get
Auth
the
provider
to
is
you
actually
end up
the system
on
that has
Auth.
implemented
So
the
Auth,
Auth
upon receiving this
protocol or
request,
Auth
sends you a
framework
login
and provides
page.
identity
You
and
supply your
authentication
credentials.
for the systems to
Auth
interact with each
provider or
other.
Auth server validates those
Now,
credentials.
once we define our actors, let's see
sends
how
what's
a
called
typical
authorization
Auth
code.
flow looks like,
That
and how
authorization
it
code
solves
is
the
like a
issue
short-living
we
code.
saw, the issues we saw earlier.
And now it's
The
sent, that
typical
code that sends out
Auth
to
flow
the client.
looks like
The client
this. The
receives
first,
that, extracts
the
it out,
app
and
requests
sends another request
access
to the
to
Auth server,
a resource,
saying, hey, I
makes
got
an
an
API
authorized
call to say, hey, give me a
authorization
contact
code.
list or an image
Please
from
exchange
this
it for
endpoint, and this
access to it.
says, oh,
So
you're not logged in.
this Auth server
You're not
validates
authorized.
the
Please,
authorization
please
code.
log in here.
Everything
so it sends
checks
a
out
302
and then
redirect
generates
to the
an
client.
access token in the
This is just typical, but
here,
it might not
the
be.
app
It
receives
might not be a
the
302 like
access
this. If
token
this is a single page
and
application,
sends
this
the
might just
request
send you straight,
for
clicking
data
on a sign in
using that
button
access
or
token.
clicking on
Now
pull
the
contacts
resource
or
server
whatever. It
validates the
might
access
just send
token.
you straight to
If everything
this,
is
but
fine,
so
then
you get the
now
to
sends
you end
the
up on
whatever information
Auth. So Auth,
is requested
upon receiving
over
this
to
request,
the app.
sends you a login
Now,
page. You supply
this
your
is a typical
credentials.
flow, right?
Auth,
So let's see how it
provider or
solves
Auth server validates
each of
those
the issues we
credentials
talked about earlier. The first
and
one is,
sends what's called authorization
a
code.
third-party app
That
potentially having
authorization code
access
is like a
to
short-living
your
code.
credentials, like storing your
And
credentials.
now
But in this
that
case,
code is that
as you have
sent
seen
out
here
to
in
the client
step
receives that,
3,
extracts it out, and
this
sends
page, this
another
login
request
page
to
is
the
provided
auth server
by the
saying,
OAuth,
hey, I got an
So it
authorized
may be pop-up,
authorization code.
or it may
Please
be
exchange it
even with the
for
same
access token.
browser.
So
But
this auth
this
server
page
validates
is
the
entirely
authorization
controlled by
code.
OAuth.
Everything
So
checks out
the app
and then generates
or the
an access token and
application you are
refresh
on
token.
is completely
Here,
unaware
the
of
app
this
receives
communication
the access token
between you and the
and sends
OAuth
the
provider.
request to pull
So
data using
it's
that
not
access
getting
token.
access to your
Now,
credentials. So it
the
solves the
resource server validates the
the
access
first
token.
problem. The
Everything
second problem is
is
you wanted to be able to
fine.
limit
Then now it
what
sends
access,
the whatever
what
information
permission
is
this
requested
app is
over
gonna
to the
have,
app.
or which data, which
Now,
resource.
so this is a typical
So I
flow,
don't
right?
have,
So let's see how
I
it
don't have
solves
it
the
here.
each of the
But what
issues we talked
happens
about
right
earlier.
here
The first one
is
is,
upon receiving
a third party
right
app
here when it
potentially having
sends the
access
request to
to
the OAuth
your
server, the
credentials,
authentication
like
request
storing your
to
credentials.
the
But in this case,
OAuth server,
as you have seen here
the
in
client
step
specifies
3,
what kind of access it's requesting.
this
So
page, this login page, is
upon
provided
successful
by
login
the
here in step 4,
Auth. So it may
there
be
is what's
pop-up
called a
or it may
consent
be even with the same
page that
browser.
comes back to
But
the user.
this page
It's
is
asking the
entirely
user, the
controlled by
OAuth will
Auth.
ask the
So
user, hey,
the app
this app is
or the
going to be able to
application you are
download
on
your
is
list of contacts,
completely
or this
unaware
app
of
is going
this
to be able to
communication between
post to your
you
Facebook
and the
page, or
Auth
send
provider.
friend requests to,
So it's not getting access to your
yeah.
credentials.
So
So it solves the one
all that
the,
is
the
will
first
be explicitly
problem. The
listed
second
for
problem is
you
you wanted to be able to
approve.
limit
So you can say, oh
what
no,
access
and then you can cancel out,
what
and that will break
permission
the whole
this app
process
is gonna
and
have
fail
for
the
which to
process.
which data, which resource.
Or you can agree and everything
So
will
I
flow.
don't
So
have
it gives you a
I don't
chance
have
to
it
see what
here,
this
but
app
what
is going to be
happens
able to
right
do,
here is
and it
upon
gives you a chance
receiving
to say, to agree, to
right here
consent.
when it sends the request to
That's
the
one piece.
OAuth
The other piece is
server,
any
the
OAuth
authentication
provider
request
right now,
to the
it has,
OAuth
if you
server,
go to, like,
the
it could be
client
Gmail or
specifies
Yahoo, or
what kind of access it's
Microsoft or Amazon,
requesting.
whatever.
So
In your account page,
upon
in your account
successful
or
login
profile page,
here in step 4,
it's going to show you all
there is
third-party
what's called
apps that
a
you have
consent
allowed to access
page
what
that comes
resource.
back to the user.
So
It's
at
asking
any
the
time,
user,
you could just
the
go remove
Auth will
that
ask
plan
the
or
user, hey,
remove your
this
consent,
app is
and
going to be
that
able
app
to
is
download
will
your
no
list
longer
of
be able to
contacts, or this app is going
access
to
your
be able
data.
to post to
So
your
it solves
Facebook
the second
page
problem, the
or
second issue.
send friend
Third
requests
issue,
to,
yeah, I mean the third issue as well. The second and the third
yeah.
issue I
So
talked about earlier. So
all that
at any
will
point in
be
time, you can
explicitly listed
specifically
for
invoke
you
access or
to
give
approve.
the
So
permission
you can say,
for a
oh no,
particular
and then you
app
can cancel out,
that
and
you
that will break
previously
the whole process
consented or
and
previously
fail the
allowed to
process.
have access. So that's
Or you
how
can agree
OAuth
and
solves
everything
the
will
issue
flow.
we
So
saw
it
earlier.
gives you a
Right?
chance
So
to see what this app is going to be able to do.
let's move
And
on
it gives you a
to
chance to say
further
to agree
how
to
OAuth
consent.
flow looks like, or
That's one
what
piece. The
possible
other piece
flows
is
are there.
any Auth
But before
provider
then, let's
right
define
now, like
another
it
term,
has, if you
which
go
is
to,
endpoint.
could be Gmail or
Endpoints
Yahoo
are
or
also,
Microsoft or Amazon,
REST
whatever.
API endpoints.
In your account page, in your
URL
account or
endpoints,
profile
URIs,
page, it's going to show you all
where
third-party
through which
apps
these
that you
actors
have
that we
allowed
defined earlier
to
interact
access
with each other
what
or talk to each
resources.
other.
So
So there
there's
are
at
four
any
types
time
of
you
endpoints.
could just go
The
remove
authorization
that plan
endpoint,
or
token
remove your
endpoint, those
consent,
provided by the
and that app
authorization
is no
service or
longer
authorization
be able
provider.
to
We're going to
access
talk
your
about
data.
them next.
So it
So
solves
I'll
the
talk about
second
two
issue.
here, redirectory
Third
URL
issue, yeah,
and
the
resource
third
URL.
issue as well. The
Redirect
second and the third
URL
issue I talked about
is
earlier. So,
provided by
at
the
any point
client.
in time, you
The
can
client,
specifically
this is
invoke
the
access or
endpoint that
the permission
this
for a
is the endpoint
particular
that
app
the client
that you
tells the
previously
auth
consented or
provider,
you previously
hey,
allowed to have
once
access.
you generate
So
access
that's
token
how
or once you
OAuth
generate
solves the issue
authorization
we
code,
saw earlier.
send it over here.
Right?
So it's provided by the client. It's how it tells the
let's move on
to
to
contact it back.
further how OAuth flow looks like, or
the resource
what
endpoint
possible
is provided by
flows
the
are
resource
there and all.
provider.
But before then, let's
provides
define
secure
another
API
term, which is endpoints.
To access your data.
Endpoints are also,
the
REST
authorization
API
endpoint,
URL
earlier, provided by
endpoints,
the
URIs,
provider. It takes
where
a GET
through
request,
which these
get
actors
type
that we
HTTP
defined
method.
earlier interact with each other or talk to each other.
what it does is it generates authorization code,
authorization endpoint,
or
both
in case of implicit flow, which we'll talk about later. In case of implicit flow, it actually generates access token.
Next.
So what it does is standardized, but how the URL is formed
redirect URL
not standardized. Like you might
have
the
client.
login.microsoftonline.com
/
endpoint
that this is the endpoint that
the
client
tells
Microsoft
might have it that way.
provider,
Google might have it in a different way. So what it does
once you generate access token or once you generate authorization
the URL format
send it over here. So it's provided
provided
by the client. It's how
Auth provider
it
has
tells the
implemented
Auth to contact it.
There are different parameters that are associated with this.
It's provided by the resource provider.
It
provides
for
secure API
cross-site, scripting attacks to prevent that, and also like if you have
the authorization endpoint
mentioned earlier, provided by the correlate those
provider.
Requests together.
Get request, get type HTTP
you can send it, and the Auth will send it back to you. So
what it does is it generates authorization code,
prevents
or
attacks as well.
Case of implicit flow,
scope,
which we'll talk
scope
about
is
later.
where you define
of
what kind
flow,
of access you're requesting,
access
as
token.
we talked about earlier.
So what it
when
does
you send
is
the authorization request
how
into
the
this
URL is formed
server,
is
you tell it, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to read the contact list.
Login.microsoftonline.com / Auth /
his email
/ authorize. Microsoft might
the response type.
Google
is
might
what kind of response type.
So what it does
earlier,
is
generally the authorization
standard,
but returns authorization
URL format
in case of implicit
the
flow,
how
it
the
returns
access provider has implemented
so
it.
this is where we define what
there are different parameters that are
client ID
with this.
Client ID is the unique identifier for the third-party app that you're delegating access to. So the client
attacks to prevent
the client,
that,
in order for the client to be able to participate in that OAuth process, the client should have already registered with the Auth provider.
back to
so
you.
before
that's
how all this is set up, the client goes in and registers registers with the Auth provider, and that's when it gets
the scope is where you define
and
what
that's
kind
how
of access you're
Auth
requesting.
provider identifies
about earlier, when you
the
send
client.
the authorization
So the client ID is
request
that
into
redirect
this
URL as we talked
server,
earlier. This is where
this is what I wanted.
I want to read the contact list. Once you generate the code,
I want
send it over to this URL.
His email or something.
Token endpoint is the other
response type.
endpoint.
Generally, the authorization endpoint
takes
returns authorization code, but in case of
generates access
flow,
token and refresh
it returns access token.
The same thing
so
here.
This is where
what it does is standard, but the URL format
client
for the
ID.
token endpoint.
Client ID is the unique identifier for the third-party app that you're delegating access to. So the client. In order for the client to be able to participate in that OAuth process,
and grant type,
the client should have already
and code
registered
the grant type is
the
like
provider.
This is
so before,
this token
all this is set up,
this token
the client goes in
some
and
cases
registers them.
It receives a
with the
authorization
provider,
code,
and that's when it gets
changes
the
it into
ID.
and generates
and that's how
Auth
token
provider
identifies.
Sometimes in some flows,
the client.
It
so
receives
the client ID is that
client credentials,
redirect URL as we
ID
talked
and
earlier.
secret, and
this is
token.
where
in some cases it
off,
receives
once you
resource
generate the
owner
code,
password
send
and
it over
password,
to
the
this
username
URI.
and generates. So the grant type is defines what you're sending it.
Token endpoint is the other
code is the
endpoint.
The data,
and
the actual
it takes
that you're
a
sending
post method
to it.
Generates access token and refresh token.
So once we define our access
and
endpoints, next is we're going to talk
URL
about
format.
Before I
start,
I would like to ask if there are any
the segments. It's dependent. It's different across different providers. There are different parameter names. The ones that we saw were client ID,
I'll take that as
URI, and grant type is also and code.
So
grant type is like this token.
All flows
this token endpoint in some cases
sequence of
it receives a authorization code
between
and
the
changes
actors.
it into
So
and
we say
generates
we define our actors,
token
we
and
define
returns
our
token.
endpoints.
Sometimes
so these
in some
actors
flows,
communicate with each
it
other in a
receives
request
client
response
credentials like
format,
client ID and client secret
are
and generates
using
token.
those endpoints.
In
That
some
whole thing
cases,
is
it
called
receives resource owner
flow,
password, like the
or
actual password and
the OAuth
username,
flow.
and generates. So
There
the
are
grant
several
type is,
kinds of
defines
OAuth
what
flows,
you're sending it,
and we're going
and
to
then
talk about
the code
now.
is the
They
associated
are good.
the data, the actual payload that
they
you're
are good
sending
for
it
different
over
scenarios.
to receive the token.
The first one is called
so once we
authorization
define
code
our
flow.
actors and endpoints, next is
The
we're going to talk
authorization
about
code
flows. But
flow
before I start, I would like to ask if there are any
is the
questions
default
so far.
code flow type. It's also the most secure
Any questions?
flow. It's the most secure because it validates the identities of all the actors that are involved. The
so
auth provider,
flows. What
the
are
resource
auth
owner,
flows?
and the client. So
Auth
it
flows
validates
are
all of
discrete
these,
sequence of
the identities of
requests
these three
and
actors
response,
that are involved in the flow.
between the
So
actors.
it's most secure.
So
The
we
others
say
could
we
be even
define our
considered
actors,
as
we define our
variations.
endpoints. So these actors
or
communicate with each other in
simplifications
a
of
request
this flow.
response
Right?
format.
So this is
Are
the
using
typical,
those
and this is what we
endpoints.
saw
That
actually
whole
earlier.
thing is
It's the
called
same
flow, or the auth flow. There are
app
several
makes a
kinds
request
of
to
auth
the
flows,
resource server,
and we're going to
it
talk
gets
about
a
them
302
now.
redirect to the
They are
authorization
good.
endpoint. So this
They
call is
are
going
good
to
for
the
different
authorization endpoint.
scenarios.
It has the scope and things like that.
The first one is called authorization
in this
code
case,
flow.
and then this sends
The authorization code flow
login page. User
is
logs
the
in,
default.
and this so as I mentioned
code
earlier,
flow
in
type,
order for
it's
this
also the most secure
auth to be successful,
flow.
or like for the app to
the most
have
secure
this functionality built into it,
the identities
it must
of
have
all
already
the actors
registered
that are
with
involved.
the auth provider. So
the
when it
auth provider,
registers,
the resource owner, and the client,
it defines
so
that
it
the
validates
scopes that
all
it
of
has.
these, the identities of these three
So it must
actors that are involved
include a
in the
scope
flow.
that
So
it
it's most
can
secure. The others
access
could
it,
be
or
even
it can
considered
request.
as variations.
So if this API
or
and this app where
simplifications of
if
this
this API
right, so this
does
is
not
the typical,
allow
and
for
this is
this
what we
app
saw actually earlier.
to have
it's the same
access to a certain thing, or like to be able to request
app makes a request to the
as a given
resource
scope,
server,
it will be denied.
Gets a
so
to redirect to the
but so it will
authorization
send
endpoint.
scope,
So this call is going
that
to the
it's
authorization
able to
endpoint.
request. But
it has a
after
scope and
the
things
user
like
login
that.
is validated, as I mentioned earlier,
and
there's
then
a
this
consent
sends
process here. But once
a
everything is checked,
login page, user
the
logs in,
code is generated and sent out.
So as
Once
I mentioned earlier, in order
received,
for this
it extracts to be the app extracts that
successful, or like for the
back
app to have this functionality built into it,
this time
it must have already registered with the auth provider. So when it registers,
the code is
checked. It defines
right?
that
The code is
scopes
checked
that
if
it
it's
has.
valid. What it also checks is
so
if
it must
this
include
code
a
is
scope
coming
that
from
it can
a
access,
client,
or it can request.
the same client that it was
so
intended
if
to,
this API
right?
and this
So
app, where
that's also valid,
if this
part of the
API
validation here, and
does
if that
not
is
allow for this
successful,
app
it will
to
generate
have
a
access to a certain thing, or like to be able to request
the app receives that,
given
extracts
scope,
it, and sends another request.
it will be denied here.
This time the resource server,
but so it will send
validates
scope
the token. If it's a
that
valid token,
able to request.
it has what it needs.
But
it will
after the
back.
user login
So this is the flow,
validated,
the
as
authorization
I mentioned earlier,
code
there's
flow.
a consent process here.
There is a slight
but
variation
everything is checked
of this flow. Now,
code is generated.
I mentioned earlier here,
once the code
part
is
of the validation
received,
step
it
here
extracts it, the app
6
extracts
and
that
7
and sends
is making
back
sure,
a request
making
to
sure
the
first of all the
author,
code that's
this
returned back
to
is a
the
valid
token
token,
endpoint,
a valid code.
And
but not only that,
this is where
it's coming
the
from
code
a
is
client
checked,
that is known by
the code is checked if
also
it's valid.
A client that
what
the code
it also
was
checks
for,
is
right?
if
this code is
coming
back
from
to the when
a client,
step 5,
the same client,
when this code is
that
returned
it
back
was
to
intended
the
to, right?
the,
so that's
the
also
app,
valid part of the
code
validation
is,
here.
like
and
right
if that
within
is
the URL. It's
successful,
actually
it
part of the
will
URL
generate
that comes back. So
access
this
token
it
and refresh
appends the
token,
code.
send it back to
The server, the OAuth server
app.
appends the
The
code
app receives that,
to the
extracts it, and
return
sends another
URL and
request.
sends
This
the browser
time
back
the
to
resource server,
so it's easy
validates
for
the token. If it's a valid token,
a third party,
it has what it needs, it will
for an
send the
attacker
data back.
to
So this is the
take
flow,
to
the
read that
authorization code
and
flow.
send a token request
There is
back
a slight
the
variation
auth server.
of this
So
flow.
that's why
Now,
the validation
I mentioned
is
earlier here,
important.
part of the validation
that is this
here
request coming
6
from the
and 7
client that
is
the
making
code
sure
was intended for.
Okay,
so,
making sure first of all the code that's returned back
because of
is a
that,
valid token,
in order
a valid
for
code. But not only that, it's
in order
coming
for the
from
client
a client
to
that is known by the auth. Also,
to tell
a client
the
that
server
the code was
its
intended
true
for,
identity,
right?
it has to do
this
it has to
this
send some
code
secret,
is
which is called
returned
client
back
secret.
to the when
But
step
in
5,
case of a
when this
public
code is
client,
returned back to the
which is public client as we defined earlier,
is the code is
this could be like a single
right within the URL. It's actually
SPA,
part
like
of the
a single
URL
page application,
that comes back. So
or it could be a public
it appends the
native
code.
app.
The server,
so
the
you
auth
cannot
server appends the
possibly
code
store
to
a
the
secret,
return
like
URL,
securely
and
store a
the browser
secret
back
on
to it.
a user's
So
device, right?
it's
So
easy for
how do we do
a
this
third party
in those scenarios? That's
for
why
an
we have
attacker
this revised
to take
version, not revised, but
read
like
that
a version
and
of the
send
auth code
a
flow,
token request
but
back
for
to
public
the
clients.
auth server.
And it's called
So that's why the
authorization
validation
code flow
is
with PKCE.
important.
That's right, PKCE, but it's
that
of
is this request coming from
key
the client that
proof of
the
key
code was intended
exchange.
for. So
what does that is what that
because
does
of
is
that,
everything else is the same except these two steps right here.
In order for the client to
the app
to tell
the web app
the server its true identity, it has to send some secret, which is called client secret.
Code verifier
but
and code challenge.
In case
these
of
are
a public client,
random strings,
which is
there are
libraries
libraries for
defined
native
earlier,
apps that that
could be
do
like
this.
a single.
But what they do is like they generate
SPA, like
strings.
a single page application, or it could be a public, a native app.
So they generate two strings
store a secret,
code verifier,
securely store a secret on a user's device, right?
Code verifier is
how do we do this
base64
in
encoded
those scenarios?
and also
that's
like
why we have this revised version, not revised, but like a version of the
form of
code
the
flow,
code challenge.
but for public.
So what it does,
clients.
It generates
and
these
it's
two,
called,
and on this
authorization code
on
flow
step 2.
That's right.
Sends the code challenge. It sends the code challenge to auth server. Auth server records that
key code exchange.
And
what does that
all this process
does is everything else is the same except these two steps.
When the client sends a request for the token endpoint,
there
the app, the code, the authorization
or
code,
the web app
with a token
generates
now this time it sends the other thing, the
code verifier and code challenge. These are random strings.
It already has
there are libraries
challenge.
For native apps
now it
that
verifies
that
it
do
uses
this.
But
what they do
verifier
is like they generate
to verify if they match. So if they're too much, that means okay, this is the value.
So they generate two strings.
So it's
called
okay
code verifier and code challenge.
So that's the difference.
Code verifier is like a base64 encoded and also like SHA-256 encrypted form of the code challenge.
The next,
what it does, it generates these two, and on step 2 sends the code challenge.
The next flow is
to auth server. Auth server records that, and
the implicit
what it
flow
does here, right? All this process. Then when on step 6, when the client sends a request for the token
the authorization code flow is the most
secure
flow.
Code,
implicit would be the least secure.
Token.
I would say.
Now this time it sends the other thing.
The difference is implicit flow does not
the auth already has the
authorized
challenge.
The token endpoint.
Now it verifies.
So if you see here,
the,
step 1 and step 2 they're the same
to verify if they match.
Step 1 and step 2 are the same.
That means okay, this is the valid.
Step 4 is the same.
So
same thing.
It's okay.
But the difference is in step 5.
So that's the difference here.
Server
this one is
instead of generating and sending authorization code in implicit flow, it actually sends access token straight up. So it sends access token. The client uses that.
The next, any questions about
the data
Auth authorization code flow?
It's not secure because, as I mentioned earlier, this state,
the next flow,
the data that's returned is returned as a plain text as part of the query
implicit flow
to the client. So it could be hijacked or it could be used by a third party. Like
we say the authorization code flow is the most secure flow. Implicit would be the least secure.
So it's not,
I would say,
not secure. Most
the difference
providers
is implicit flow does not use
turn it off this support. Their support.
The authorized
most
token
of them
endpoint.
You cannot.
So if you see here, step 1 and
some
step 2, they are the same.
Still supported, but you would have
step
to
1 and step 2 are the same.
Enable it. So by default, it would be turned off. But if you need it, you can turn it off. I know this is the case in Azure AD.
The Auth
if you want to turn on
implicit
flow,
of generating
you have to
and
actually
sending
turn it on.
authorization code in implicit flow, it actually sends access token.
So yeah, this is more or less should not be used as much as possible.
Client
should
that
be avoided,
but
sometimes
the data
you may not have any
so
option.
It's not secure because, as
why
I mentioned earlier,
why was it added in the first place?
The data that's returned is returned as a plain text as part of the query parameter
was designed
to the client.
Formulated.
So it could be hijacked.
There
or
was
it could
this
be,
cross-site
used by a third
resource
party,
sharing. There was a problem that you cannot post back
so it's
a
not
service that
not
is
secure.
of a different domain.
Most providers have
right, because of the same origin policy, which is still the case, right? You cannot send
most of
post
them
back to just a random
do implicit flow
URL.
Anymore.
Some can only do that
still support
to
it,
your own domain.
You would have to specifically
policy
enable it. So by default, it would be turned off. But if you
back
need
then,
it, you can turn
there
it off.
was no way to go around
this is
that.
the case in Azure AD.
Right? So
if you want
for
to turn
public
on
clients,
flow, you have to actually
for
turn
public
it on.
clients, as we say. There's no way for them to store.
So yeah, this is more or less should not be used
like
as much as possible.
They
should be avoided,
that
but sometimes
reason, and also they
may
will
not
be able to. Let's say,
but why was it,
they receive a
why
code.
was it added
now
in
they
the
have
first
to do a
place
post
is,
back.
So back
to,
when
to the token
flow,
endpoint,
Auth
to exchange that
was designed
for a token,
formulated,
but that was not possible because of
there was this cross-site.
So that's why
sharing.
It was important to have this.
There was a problem that
now
you cannot
we have
post back to a service that is not a different domain.
You can
than you
go around
because of the same origin policy,
same
which is still the
policy.
case, right? You cannot send
if the
post back to just a random URL
or the destination
you can
service
only do that to
has
your own domain.
Your
That's
domain to
call it
browser
policy, the policy
back to
that all browsers
so as
enforce
all
right
providers.
And back then there was no way to go around that.
Allow everyone to post back to their token endpoint. So you don't have any problem. You can grab the code.
There's no way for them to store
the token endpoint and get your token. So the reason this implicit flow was required is no longer
reason, and also they will not be able to.
It's still out there.
They say they receive a code. Now they have to do a post back
B2C
to the token endpoint,
but
to exchange
mostly
that
because
for a token. But that was not possible because of the same origin policy. So that's why it was important to have
the
this
Microsoft
back then. But
MSAL
now they have core
library
technology.
Has a second version.
You can cross-origin resource sharing. You can
so that you don't have to
go around. The same origin policy.
It also because of this limitation that it's less secure
URL.
It doesn't
the destination
issue a
service
token. So it doesn't
has allowed your
the
domain
token is also
to call it,
slightly
to post back to it.
So that's the measure they
providers
to make it
these
less
providers have
as it is.
Allowed everyone to post back.
The other is
token
client credential flow.
So you don't have any problem. You can grab the
as its name
code
says,
and send post
this
it back
is
to the token
intended
endpoint and
for
get your token. So
clients to use their own
reason
identity,
this implicit flow
instead of
was
the
required
user.
is no
So
longer
this is
valid.
for
So
like daemon apps or like for Windows
it's still
services
out
or
there,
scheduled
but
apps
I mean,
that don't run
it's
under
actually
user
heavily
context.
used
They
in
don't have a user
Azure
context. So
B2C,
what they do is they use
Azure
their
AD,
own
Azure
identity
B2C,
to
but
request a token and
but
get a
mostly
token.
because
So
of their client
this
libraries
is
don't still support
perfect
it,
for those
which I
kinds of
think they
apps,
are
and they are running on a server,
now
so
have.
that
Like
means
the
they have
Microsoft
secure way of storing a client
MSAL,
secret.
Microsoft
So
Authentication
they
Library,
send
has a
a
second version
request
now which
directly
supports
to
that
the token
authorization
endpoint. So
code
they
flow,
don't go through the
so that you don't have
authorized
to use
token,
implicit.
things like that. The login, there's no user to log in,
It also,
right?
because
So
of this
they send
limitation that
a
it's
token request
less secure,
directly to the
it
token
doesn't
endpoint,
issue a refresh
and
token. So it
they
doesn't
send
issue a refresh token.
with that
The
request they
token is
send
also
their
slightly
credentials. What
short-lived.
their credential is,
So
their
that's
client ID
the measure they took
and
to
their
make
client
it,
secret, both
less
provided by
vulnerable as it
the
is.
Auth provider when they register.
The other is
So they
client
send
credential
that
flow.
and
The client
scope or
credential flow
anything related to
is,
this
as its
they
name
want to be
says,
able to access here,
this is
and they
intended
get
for
Auth validates
clients to
that
use their own
client
identity,
credential and
instead
sends
of
back a
a
token,
user.
and
So this is for like daemon
then
apps or like for
this app
Windows services or
extracts the
scheduled
token
apps that
and
don't
uses
run
it to
under a
retrieve the
user
data it
context. They
needs
don't
from
have a
this
user
resource
context. So
provider.
what they do
So that's
is
the client
they use their
credential.
own identity.
It doesn't use the
to
authorized
request a
endpoint.
token and
It
get a
directly
token.
requests access
So
token from the
this is
Auth
perfect for
access,
those kinds of
token
apps,
endpoint,
and
it's
they,
secure.
they're running on a server, so that
In
means
this
they
case,
have
because
secure way of
this
storing
is
a client
only
secret.
for apps that don't
So they
require
send
user
a request
context, and they run on a
directly
server
to the
where
token
you
endpoint.
can
So they
securely
don't go
store
through the
secret.
authorized token, things like that. The login,
The
there's no user
other
to log in, right?
one
So
is resource
they
owner
send
password credential flow,
a token request
ROPC.
directly to the token endpoint.
This is
And
a bit of a
they
deviation,
send
I
with
feel, like
that request, they send their
from what we've
credentials.
been saying.
What their credential is,
This
their
is
client ID,
this is
and their client secret,
you
those
are
provided
giving
by
the app
the Auth provider when
your
they
credentials.
register.
So if you notice
So
here,
they send that in scope or anything
step one
related to
and
this.
step two,
They want to be able to access
the
here,
app provides
and
you
they
a
get
page where you
Auth
supply your
validates
username
that
and password,
client credential,
and the
sends
app
back a token,
sends
and
that over to
then
the
this app
over to the
extracts the
server,
token
and
uses it to
the
retrieve
server
the data
replies
it
back
needs from this
with
resource
a
provider.
token.
So that's the client credential flow.
And
It
the
doesn't
app
use the
extracts the
authorized
token and sends
endpoint.
the request.
It
The
directly
source is
requests
returned.
access token from
Now,
the
yes,
Auth,
so you're giving your
token
credentials
endpoint, and
to
it's secure
the app.
in this case because this is only for
it's
apps that don't
it's not
require
it's also not recommended right now.
context,
Like
and
it's
they
not
run on a
recommended
server where
flow, but
can
there is a
securely
necessity
store
for it.
a secret.
One of the reasons is there are industries,
The other
actually, like
one
banking
is
industry,
resource owner
who
password
have
credential
not
flow,
adopted
ROPC. This
very
is a
well.
bit of a deviation, in my view, like from what
you'd have
we've
to
been
do
saying.
this
This
in
is
a way, though,
actually
but
this
it's not
is
like exactly
you
like what
are
we saw earlier, where
giving
Yelp
the
or
app
Facebook early
your
forms.
credentials.
Because
So
in
if you
this
notice
case, there
here,
is there's scope for things like
step
that
1 and step 2,
that are
the
important,
app
and the token
provides
is
you
also
a
short
page
time limit.
where
Like,
you
it's
supplied your
only
username and
valid for a
password,
certain period of time. So
and the app
even if you give
sends
your
that over to
password
the
out to a third party app,
server, and
ultimately
the
what's
server
used
replies
is a
back
token, and this
a
token
token,
is restricted
and
by scope,
the app extracts the
also
token and
is
sends the
restricted
request. The source is
by
returned.
time.
Now, yes, so you're giving your
generally
credentials
it's not
to
recommended
the
unless like it's internal communications. I know, like for example, B2C, Azure B2C and Azure AD.
It's not
internally
it's
they
also not
communicate with each
recommended
other
right now.
through
Like,
our
it's not
OPC,
recommended
but
flow,
it's like
but
server to
there's a
server
necessity
communication
for it.
themselves.
One of the
not
reasons is
exposed to
there
the
are
user.
industries, actually, like banking industry,
there are cases like,
who
as I
have
mentioned,
not
banking.
adopted
I use Mint a lot. Like,
Auth
I don't know if you know
very well.
Mint.com.
So
I think it's an Intuit software.
You'd have to do this.
They
in
use
a way,
this,
though, but it's not
because they deal with
exactly like what we
banking,
saw earlier, where
banking
Yelp or
industry, and
Facebook early
has
forms.
adapted Auth.
Because in this case, there is there's scope or things like that.
So
that are involved.
next,
And the token is
the
also short time
refresh.
Like, it's only valid
flow.
for a certain period of time. So
The token refresh
even if you
flow
give your
is
password out to a third-party app, it's where ultimately what's used is a token,
basically,
and this token is
why do you ask a user to log in again and again when the token expires
by time?
Assume it's if it's an app and the user is still using your app, you don't want to pop up a
internal communication. I know, like for example, B2C
every time
B2C and
Azure
AD. Internally, they communicate with each other through our OPC. But it's like server-to-server
refresh token is
it's not
has a slightly not slightly actually much longer
there are cases like
time
I mentioned
period,
like I use Mint a lot, like I don't know if you know the Mint.com,
the app
and Intuit
sends
software.
A request
they use
to
this
the
because
token
they
in
deal
the
with
point,
a lot of banking,
a refresh token in the point
banking industry,
of
and that
the
industry hasn't
OAuth
adapted OAuth very well.
And so along with this request sends the refresh token.
So
and then
next is
the app
the
sends
token
access
refresh
token back. So the user doesn't have to.
The token refresh flow
this is in silent,
as its name makes it
so
clear. It's
makes usability and user experience perfect.
Basically, why do you ask a user to log in again and again
when the
token expires?
Here, this one is much
select, like, and the user is still using
a much later addition.
You don't want to pop
it's not even an addition. I think it's just an extension
page every time
to extension
token
that I think
expires.
Companies like Google and others that are big players.
A refresh token is
they developed it.
It has a slightly
pushing
not slightly actually much longer time.
So it's considered
like
the standard, but
it's an extension
access
token.
Standard when it was not part of the original
the app sends
standards or flows.
A request to
the token this is point, for things like smart TVs, IoT devices, and printers that this
they don't have with this request sends the refresh token.
A good way of input.
The app sends access token back.
Constraint devices.
So the user doesn't.
You don't have a keyboard or something to put in.
This is a silent update. So makes usability and user experience perfect.
Ran through this recently when I signed up for
other flow
YouTube TV, right?
Here. So this one is much.
What happens is
like
there is a device code in the point.
It's not even an addition. I think it's just an extension.
That
extension.
Auth server
I think
implements
companies like Google,
so it sends a request.
That are big players,
request goes out to the Auth.
They developed it and
server to the device code
for it to be part of the standard. So it's considered the
server responds with some data. It responds with
not part of the
device code, verification code.
Standards.
Verification URL. Basically, it tells you
for,
to
things like smart TVs,
say, here's the
IoT
code,
devices,
and please go to this URL and put in that code.
They don't have good way of.
I think Apple TV, I think, also works this way, but I've seen it with YouTube TV recently.
You don't have a keyboard or
as soon as you open the YouTube TV on your smart TV, you see a code. This is a code. Log into I think tv.youtube.com/start. And then and then the device starts polling.
YouTube
so it starts polling for authorization.
What happens is
starts polling for
there is a device code in the point.
So this is a loop
that
in the meantime you go to
the Auth server
you
implements
up your other device.
So it sends a request.
Or your computer or
goes
laptop
out to the Auth
and go to that verification URL. Then you go to that verification URL. It asks
server responds with some data. It responds with
count,
device code, verification code. Verification URL.
For
basically, it tells you
once it asks you to log in and
say,
validated,
it asks
you to give
and please go to this URL and put in that
the device code you've received in step 2. So you put that in.
I think
then now you're authenticated. and your device now will have
recently. So
a
token. As soon as you open the YouTube TV on your smart TV, you see a code. This is a code. Log into like
the device stores that token here,
start,
and then after that,
and then
starts,
and then the device starts polling
to request,
so it starts polling for authorization.
TV content
starts
or whatever.
polling for like
so this is the device authorization
so this is a loop
flow. As I mentioned,
in the meantime, you go to like you pull up your other device like your smartphone or your computer or your laptop.
So those are the
verification URL.
The
so
apps,
you go to that verification URL. It asks you to log in.
There's a very good playground I came across.
Asks you to log into a Gmail account that you
sponsored by Auth,
that you signed up for TV for. So
authorization providers.
It asks you to log in. Once that's validated, it asks you to give the device code. So the device code you've received in state
right
2,
here,
you put that in.
It actually you can
then
you, you can play with all this
and your device
flow types.
Will have
yourself,
token.
And it's a very good simple website to practice or to see
so the device stores that token here. And then after that,
authorization code
to
it's simulating everything. So you have to first register a client,
like if it's TV content or whatever.
Register a client.
So this is the device
client for you.
Authorization.
This is the user account login name. So I'm going to keep it here.
Later addition.
Continue. All right. Now this is the authorization URL. So it's going to this is the authorizing point, right? So you say authorize. So it asks you the login page.
The apps.
So this is coming from the authorization code
playground I came across.
I mean the authorization point.
Sponsored by Auth, which is one of the
now the user has authenticated. Now this is the state where this is the consent page. So this is a application Auth playground would like to have the ability to access your photos because it figured that out because
it actually you can play with all these flow types.
So you say, all right,
it's a very good
now you get a
simple
website. So this token is appended.
To see,
as you can see it here over here, actually. So it's appended directly as a query parameter to the
it's simulating everything. So you have to first register a client.
So also state,
register a client.
Right here,
generates
and
the client
state
for you.
This
is the user account login name, so I'm going to keep it here.
Protect,
continue.
All right, is it coming from the same?
This is the authorization
from where I'm expecting.
This is the authorizing.
This is like here.
Right?
That's the state stored by client.
The login page
stored by the client, and the state that's returned from the auth provider.
The authorization code.
That's they match.
I mean the authorization point.
So it's like if I say password start over.
Now the user has authenticated. But now this is the state where this is the
you're going to exchange the authorized code.
Application Auth playground would like to have the ability to access your photos because it figured that out.
You got this response back
because of the scope that in the previous state.
The scopes that
was mentioned, right?
You can use this.
So you say, all right, approve that.
Right. So
now you get a token. See, so this token is appended
type.
As you can see it here over here, actually. So it's appended directly as a query parameter to the return URL, to the direct URL
you want. This scope right here,
also
this
state
will only be used
that's the code
to do
right
the things
and
that
state is, as I mentioned earlier, this is where you can
so this is the authorization flow.
All right,
the same way
coming from the same
device code of 90
from where I'm expecting it from. So
this
is like that's the state stored by client. This is the state stored by the client. And the state that's returned
built on
from
top
the
of
Auth provider.
But anyway, you can play with it. It's
like,
a very
do they match? They do. So
practice.
Like, if I say string wrong, start over, it will start over. Doesn't match. But okay, it matched. Continue. Now you're gonna exchange the authorized code, authorization code.
That's actually
for
what I have for you today.
So it's waiting. There you go. So you got this response back. This is your
fresh token. Yeah. If you have any questions, please.
There's the scopes that you
can
use.
We did have one question in the chat.
Right, so this is your,
somebody asked the difference between OAuth 1 and 2.
It's a BR type.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So OAuth 1 and 2, they're both standards. It started with OAuth 1.0,
the data you want. This scope right here,
it's much more complicated. I actually had to work with OAuth 1.0 recently, whereas I was doing something, just personal thing on
so
Twitter's
this is the authorization
APIs.
flow, the
Like
same
I was
way,
trying
implicit,
to pull,
PKCE,
tweets
device code
based
of
on
90,
search
90
tweets. So some of the endpoints they have
it's a whole new
are on OAuth 1.0.
standard.
So it's much complicated to implement.
But anyway, you can play with it. It's a very good
so
practice location.
It's not as granular as 2.0.
Let me go back to
it's actually considered obsolete.
Right. So
should not.
That's actually what I have for you today.
Earlier, if you're not working with an API that has still not.
That's it. Yeah. If you have any questions, please ask.
Great. Another question just came in. How complicated is it to build an OAuth server? Somebody asked the difference between OAuth 1 and 2.
Sure, absolutely.
I can't say
so
how much
effort 1 and 2, they're both standards.
Especially
it started with OAuth 1.0.
The magnitude of some of the Auth providers
but it's much more complicated. I actually had to work with OAuth 1.0 recently. Whereas I was doing something,
but I mean, you have to figure
on
everything out
Twitter's
from
APIs, like
token validation,
tweets,
client registration.
So some of the endpoints they have,
token generation, security-wise, certificate, everything. But it's absolutely possible.
It's much complicated.
There are libraries
to implement,
like Identity Server, for example, in .NET. That you could use to generate.
It's not as granular as
and validate token yourself,
and it's actually considered obsolete and should not be used. Except unless, as
for
I mentioned earlier,
an application, if you're not going into the
API that has still not adopted
identity provider business.
Right.
I would say
another question just came in. How complicated is it to build an OAuth server
by other companies?
I can't say how much effort it would be, but
it would have to be, especially if you're building. Well, what did you mean by that?
The magnitude of some of the Auth banking systems, they still you provide username and password,
and you have to figure.
They don't have endpoints or that
token validation,
Auth provider, either an external Auth provider or Auth provider that they built
generation,
themselves. They haven't adopted the everything to standard. But so it's you'd have to give.
I mean, there are libraries like Identity Server, for example, in .NET.
Prism, so I use it for. It's an app
you could use to
very helpful app, actually, both of them. I use it at Prism for like payments, bill payment. So I had to give it like the accounts that I use for bill payment. But I had to actually give the password for an application if you're to be able to pull funds and move funds around, right?
Identity provider business.
And whenever I change my credentials, I have to update them.
Say,
that's because
using what has been
the service providers
or would be much more preferable.
The resource providers that have
one comment saying
like
my banks
don't have so the third-party apps will have to get my credentials
banking systems
themselves as
still
as
like
me.
You provide username and password, and they don't have endpoints or that
you think banking
with, an Auth provider, either an external Auth provider or an Auth provider that they build themselves. They haven't adopted the Auth
another scenario
you'd
where
have to
you might need the ROPC,
like Mint. I mentioned, for example, I use it all. Mint
and
Prism also. I use it for it's an app I use. Very helpful app, actually, both of them. I use it by Prism for like payments,
not only
bill payment. But so I had to give it like the accounts that I use for bill payment. I had to actually give the password for them to be able to pull funds and move funds.
So you have to actually that app has to use credentials to log
and whenever I change my credentials, I have to update them as well. That's because
so not just
the service providers,
the third-party apps, but apps built by the resource provider themselves
have your data. Like my banks don't have
ROPC.
Auth, so the third-party apps will have to get my credentials and present themselves as me, and log in.
Interesting. So I think that does. So thank you, Yosef. It was very cool and very helpful.
I know.
Something we all need to know as application developers. This is a pretty
another scenario where you might need the
RPC
RPC resource
I will be
owner
posting the
password
slide
credential
deck
is
to the Meetup page as soon as
apps that
I get that from
were
Yosef,
built
and
that
so you can. There should
built
be a
by the same
notification that goes out
like
as soon as
not
that's available.
only third-party
And you
apps,
can
but
download that
for
and check it out
example,
for yourself.
Bank of America app, for
And that's a
example.
pretty cool tool he
It's an
referenced
app
as
that
far
you
as
have installed,
kind of getting
built by
started and
Bank of America themselves.
figuring out what's
So you have
possible
to
and
actually
what to
that
use.
app
So
has to use the credentials to log into the
and
services.
so again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you all can join us
So not just
December 3rd
the
for
third-party apps, but
look
apps
at .NET
built
5.
by the
good talk by
app
Stuart.
provider, the resource provider themselves.
Hope everybody stays safe,
sometimes need to
and
use
hope nobody's getting too much election fatigue in the past days. So great, thanks. Have a good weekend, and we will see you all next month. Before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye.
All right, so I think that does us. So thank you, Yosef. This was very cool and very helpful. Something we really all need to know as application developers. This is a pretty critical skill. So awesome. So I will be posting the slide deck to the Meetup page as soon as I get that from Yosef, and so you can. There should be a notification that goes out as soon as that's available, and you can download that and check it out for yourself. And that's a pretty cool tool he referenced as far as kind of getting started and just figuring out what's possible and what to use. So definitely check that out. And so again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you all can join us December 3rd for our look at .NET 5. That should be a pretty good talk by Stuart. And hope everybody stays safe, and hope nobody's getting too much election fatigue in the past days. So have a good weekend, and we will see you all next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye.
Bye.